She walked into his house like she owned it, knew where everything was, and claimed she'd been living there in her dreams for months. David sat at his old wooden desk, typing away on his laptop. The rain outside was getting heavier, hitting the windows of his small cottage like tiny stones. He had been living here for 6 months now, ever since his grandmother passed away and left him this place. It was quiet, peaceful, and exactly what he needed after his divorce. The cottage was old but cozy. It sat at the end of a dirt road surrounded by tall trees that swayed in the wind. The nearest neighbor was miles away, which was perfect for David. He was a writer, and the silence helped him think. Tonight he was working on an important article that was due tomorrow morning. David pushed his glasses up his nose and stretched his fingers. He had been typing for hours and his back was getting stiff. The cottage made all sorts of sounds at night. The wooden floors creaked. The old pipes made strange noises, and sometimes the wind made the whole house seem to whisper. But David had gotten used to these sounds. They had become his companions during the long, quiet evenings. He took a sip of his cold coffee and made a face. It tasted terrible, but he needed the energy to finish his work. The article was about small towns and how they were changing. It was interesting work, but deadlines were always stressful. David rubbed his eyes and looked at the clock. It was almost midnight. Outside, the storm was getting worse. The old cottage had weathered many storms before, and David felt safe inside its thick walls. His grandmother had always said this place was special, that it had a way of bringing the right people together at the right time. David used to think she was just being sentimental, but lately, he had started to feel like the cottage was more than just a house. He turned back to his laptop and started typing again. The words flowed easily tonight, which was unusual. Sometimes writing felt like pulling teeth, but tonight it felt natural, like the story was telling itself. David smiled to himself. Maybe his grandmother was right about this place having some kind of magic. Then he heard something that made him stop typing. It was the sound of the front door opening. David froze, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He lived alone, and no one ever visited him here. The nearest town was 20 minutes away by car, and everyone there barely knew his name. At first, he thought it might be the wind. The front door had a loose latch that he kept meaning to fix. Sometimes strong winds could push it open. But then he heard footsteps on the wooden floor of the living room. These were not the random sounds of a door blowing in the wind. These were the deliberate steps of a person walking through his house. David's heart started beating faster. He slowly pushed his chair back from the desk, trying not to make any noise. Who could be in his house at this time of night? And why hadn't they knocked? His mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was a lost traveler seeking shelter from the storm. Maybe it was someone with bad intentions. Maybe he was just imagining things. The footsteps continued, slow and careful, as if the person knew exactly where they were going. David could hear them moving through the living room, past the old sofa where he watched movies, past the fireplace where he burned wood on cold nights. The sounds were coming closer to his small office. David looked around his desk for something to defend himself with. All he had was a heavy paperweight that his grandmother had given him years ago. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. He picked it up and stood slowly, his legs feeling shaky. Then the footsteps stopped. David held his breath and listened. The rain outside seemed louder now, drumming against the roof like 1,000 fingers. The old cottage creaked and groaned in the wind, but inside, everything was silent. David wondered if he had imagined the whole thing. Maybe the stress of the deadline was making him hear things that weren't there. But then he heard a new sound. It was the soft rustle of wet clothing, like someone taking off a coat. David's mouth went dry. Someone was definitely in his house, and they were making themselves comfortable. He gripped the paperweight tighter and took a deep breath. Slowly, very slowly, David turned around in his chair. His office door was open, and beyond it, he could see into the living room. What he saw there made him forget how to breathe. A woman stood near his sofa. She was maybe 30 years old, with reddish-brown hair that was wet from the rain. She was taking off a soaked jacket, moving with a calmness that seemed impossible given the situation. She wasn't looking around like someone who had broken into a stranger's house. Instead, she moved like she belonged there, like she had done this routine many times before. David wanted to say something, to ask who she was and what she was doing in his house. But the words stuck in his throat. There was something about her presence that wasn't threatening. She seemed tired, like someone who had traveled a long way and finally reached home. The woman looked up and saw David watching her. Their eyes met across the room, and something strange happened. Instead of the shock or embarrassment he expected to see, her face showed a kind of relief, like she had been looking for him and finally found him. She didn't apologize for entering his house without permission. She didn't explain who she was or why she was there. Instead, she simply nodded at him, as if they had planned to meet here all along. Then she picked up a small bag she had brought with her and walked toward the bathroom, still moving with that same strange familiarity. David sat there, holding the paperweight, trying to make sense of what was happening. Nothing about this situation was normal, yet somehow it didn't feel wrong. It felt like the beginning of something important, something that had been waiting to happen for a very long time. David heard the bathroom door close softly. He sat frozen in his chair, still gripping the paperweight, trying to understand what had just happened. A complete stranger had walked into his house like she owned it, and somehow he hadn't felt the urge to call the police or run away. Something about her presence felt familiar, though he was certain he had never seen her before in his life. The sound of running water came from the bathroom. David slowly set down the paperweight and stood up. His legs felt wobbly, like he had been sitting for days instead of hours. He walked quietly to the living room and saw her wet jacket draped over the back of his sofa. It was a simple blue jacket, nothing fancy, but it looked well worn, like it had traveled many miles. Next to the jacket was a small brown bag, the kind people use for overnight trips. It wasn't a large suitcase like someone planning to stay for weeks would bring. It looked more like someone had packed quickly, taking only what they needed. David stared at these items, trying to find clues about who this woman was and why she was here. The bathroom door opened, and David quickly moved back toward his office, not wanting to seem like he was snooping through her things. The woman emerged wearing one of his grandmother's old robes. David's breath caught in his throat. That robe had been hanging on the bathroom door for months. He had never moved it because it still smelled faintly of his grandmother's perfume, and it comforted him to know it was there. But seeing this stranger wearing it should have felt wrong. Instead, it looked natural, like the robe had been waiting for her all along. The woman had towel-dried her hair, and now David could see that it was a beautiful auburn color, with natural waves that caught the light from the old lamp in the living room. She walked past David toward the kitchen, and he followed her, feeling like a guest in his own home. She opened the cabinet where he kept the tea, and without asking permission, she took out 2 cups. David watched in amazement as she moved around his kitchen with confidence, opening the right drawers to find spoons, knowing exactly where he kept the honey. "How do you know where everything is?" David finally found his voice. His words came out as a whisper, but in the quiet cottage they sounded loud. The woman looked at him as she filled the kettle with water. Her eyes were green, the color of deep forest shadows, and they held a sadness that made David's chest ache. "I don't know," she said simply, "but I've been making tea in this kitchen in my dreams for months." She said it so matter-of-factly that David almost believed her. Dreams were strange things, and David had always had vivid ones. But dreaming about a specific kitchen that you had never seen was different. That was impossible. The woman put the kettle on the stove and turned to face David fully. "I know this seems crazy," she continued, her voice soft but clear. "I know you must think I'm dangerous or insane, but I promise I'm not here to hurt you or take anything from you." David studied her face. She looked tired, like someone who hadn't slept well in a long time. There were small lines around her eyes that spoke of worry or stress, but there was also something peaceful about her, like she had been carrying a heavy weight and had finally put it down. "Then why are you here?" David asked. And how did you know about this place? The woman was quiet for a moment, listening to the kettle begin to heat up on the stove. I've been having dreams about this cottage for 8 months, she said. At first, they were just strange dreams that I forgot when I woke up. But they got stronger and clearer. I started dreaming about the layout of the rooms, the way the morning light comes through that window. She pointed to the kitchen window where David ate his breakfast every day. I dreamed about the way the floorboard by the front door creaks when you step on it. I dreamed about the hidden compartment in this cabinet. She touched the cabinet door next to the stove. David's eyes widened. He had only discovered that compartment 2 weeks ago when he dropped a spoon behind the cabinet. The kettle started to whistle, and the woman turned off the heat. She poured the hot water into both cups, added tea bags, and stirred in honey just the way David liked it, though he was certain he had never told anyone his preference for honey over sugar. She handed him a cup and gestured toward the living room. They sat on the sofa together, and David noticed that she chose the exact spot where he always sat when he was alone, while she took the other end, the end that always felt empty. I know you think this is impossible, she said, wrapping her hands around her warm cup. I thought so too, but the dreams became so real that I could taste the tea we made together, feel the texture of this sofa, hear the sound your typewriter makes late at night. David nearly dropped his cup. I don't have a typewriter, he said. The woman looked confused for a moment, then glanced toward his office where his laptop sat on the desk. In my dreams, you had an old typewriter, blue, with silver keys that stuck sometimes. David's grandmother had owned a typewriter exactly like that. It was stored in the closet upstairs, covered with a sheet. He had thought about using it sometimes for the romantic idea of being a writer with a real typewriter, but he had never taken it out of storage. What's your name? David asked, though part of him felt like he should already know the answer. Elena, she said. And you're David, though in my dreams everyone called you by your middle name. David's middle name was James, and his grandmother had always called him Jamie when he was young. His ex-wife had called him David, his friends called him Dave, but no one had called him Jamie in years. He had never told anyone that he missed hearing that name. They sat in silence for a while, drinking their tea and listening to the rain slow down outside. The storm was passing, but David felt like he was in the middle of a different kind of storm, one that was happening inside his mind and heart. Elena set down her empty cup and looked at David with those deep green eyes. I know this is strange and frightening, she said. If you want me to leave, I'll go. I can drive back to Boston tonight. But I had to come here. The dreams were so strong that I felt like I was living 2 lives, and this one felt more real than the one I was actually living. David looked at this woman who had appeared in his house like a character from a story. Everything logical in his mind told him to ask her to leave, to call someone, to treat this like the bizarre situation it was. But something deeper, something that felt older and wiser than his logical mind, told him to listen. His grandmother had always said that the cottage had its own way of bringing people together when they needed each other most. Maybe, David thought, as he looked at Elena's tired but hopeful face, his grandmother had been right about more things than he had ever imagined. The rain had stopped completely now, and the cottage felt incredibly quiet. David and Elena sat on opposite ends of the sofa, both lost in their own thoughts. The empty teacups sat on the old wooden coffee table between them, and David found himself staring at them, trying to make sense of everything that had happened in the past hour. Elena broke the silence first. Can I ask you something? She said, her voice hesitant. When did you move into this cottage? 6 months ago, David replied. My grandmother left it to me when she passed away. I came here after my divorce was finalized. I needed somewhere quiet to write and think. Elena's eyes widened slightly. 6 months ago, she repeated, more to herself than to David. That's when the dream started. David felt a chill run down his spine. What do you mean? Elena shifted on the sofa to face him more directly. I mean, the dreams about this place started exactly 6 months ago. At first, I thought they were just stress dreams. I was going through my own divorce, and my therapist said vivid dreams were normal during difficult life changes. You're divorced too? David asked, surprised. The papers were finalized 7 months ago, Elena said. I was married for 7 years to someone who was perfectly nice but completely wrong for me. We both knew it. But we kept trying to make it work because that's what you're supposed to do. David nodded slowly. His own marriage had lasted 7 years as well, and it had ended for similar reasons. He and his ex-wife had been like two people trying to fit together puzzle pieces that were from different boxes. They had spent years forcing a connection that was never meant to be. What kind of work do you do? David asked, genuinely curious about this mysterious woman who had appeared in his life. I'm an art therapist, Elena said. I work with people who have trouble expressing their feelings with words. We use painting, drawing, sculpture, whatever helps them communicate what's inside them. At least I used to. I took a leave of absence 3 weeks ago because the dreams were taking over my life. Elena stood up and walked to the window that looked out over the front yard. The moon had come out from behind the clouds, casting silver light on the wet grass and trees. I wasn't sleeping well because the dreams felt more real than my actual life. During the day I would catch myself thinking about this cottage, wondering what you were doing, if you had remembered to eat lunch, if you were staying warm enough. David felt his heart skip a beat. You thought about me specifically? I knew. There was a man living here, Elena said, still looking out the window. In my dreams, we would have breakfast together every morning. You would make coffee while I made toast, and we would sit at that little table in the kitchen and talk about our plans for the day. You were always working on some writing project, and I was always working on art pieces that I never seemed to finish. She turned back to David, and he could see tears glistening in her eyes. The strangest part was that in the dreams I felt more like myself than I ever had in real life. I felt creative and peaceful and deeply connected to someone. When I woke up, I felt like I was losing something precious every single morning. David understood exactly what she meant. For the past 6 months, he had been having his own strange experiences in the cottage. He would set 2 places at the breakfast table without thinking about it. He would buy groceries for 2 people and then wonder why he had grabbed an extra apple or an extra yogurt. Sometimes he would start conversations out loud, as if someone else was in the room with him. I've been feeling like someone else should be here, David admitted. Not just anyone, but someone specific, someone who belonged here as much as I do. I thought I was just lonely, but it was more than that. It was like I was living half of a life that was meant to be shared. Elena walked back to the sofa and sat down, this time choosing the middle cushion, closer to David. 3 weeks ago, the dreams changed, she said. Instead of just living in this cottage with you, I started dreaming that I was driving here. I would see the road, the trees, the mailbox at the end of the driveway. The dreams were so detailed that I could have drawn a map. So you decided to actually come here, David said. I tried to ignore it at first, Elena replied. I made appointments with doctors, thinking maybe I had a brain tumor or something that was causing hallucinations. But all the tests came back normal. My therapist suggested that maybe the dreams were my mind's way of telling me I needed a change in my life. Elena pulled her legs up under her on the sofa, getting more comfortable. David noticed that she moved like someone who had sat on this sofa many times before. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed a bag, got in my car, and started driving north. I didn't have an address or a map. I just followed the roads that looked familiar from my dreams. And you found this place, David said. I found this place, Elena confirmed. When I turned onto your driveway, I started crying, not because I was scared or confused, but because I felt like I was finally coming home after being away for a very long time. They sat quietly for a moment, both processing the implications of what Elena had just shared. David found himself studying her face in the soft lamplight. She had a small scar above her left eyebrow and laugh lines around her eyes. Her hands were stained with what looked like paint under her fingernails, the mark of someone who worked with art materials regularly. Can I tell you something that might sound even crazier? David said. Elena smiled for the first time since she had arrived. I don't think anything could sound crazier than what I just told you. David took a deep breath. Sometimes when I'm writing, I feel like I'm writing letters to someone. Not for publication, but personal letters to someone I care about deeply. I'll write about my day, my thoughts, things I want to share, but I have no idea who I'm writing to. What do you do with these letters? Elena asked. I saved them in a folder on my computer called Letters Home, though I don't know why I called it that. This cottage is my home now, so I'm already home. David paused, remembering something. Actually, last week I printed some of them out and put them in my grandmother's old jewelry box upstairs. I told myself it was just nostalgia, but now I'm wondering if I was saving them for someone. Elena was quiet for a long moment. In my dreams, she said slowly, you would leave me little notes. On the bathroom mirror, tucked into books I was reading, hidden in my art supplies. They were always sweet and thoughtful, like you were constantly thinking about ways to make me smile. I love writing little notes, David said, his voice barely above a whisper. I used to leave them for my ex-wife, but she thought they were silly and childish. She said we were adults and didn't need to communicate like teenagers. I would have loved getting notes like that, Elena said softly. The cottage suddenly felt very small and very intimate. David was acutely aware of Elena's presence next to him, the way she smelled faintly of rain and something floral, the way her voice had a slight rasp that was incredibly appealing. But more than physical attraction, he felt a deep sense of recognition, like his soul was waking up after a long sleep. Elena, David said, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest. Okay, she replied. Do you believe in reincarnation? Or soulmates? Or any kind of spiritual connection that can't be explained by science? Elena considered the question seriously. A month ago, I would have said no. I'm a therapist. I believe in psychology and brain chemistry and logical explanations for human behavior. But these dreams, this feeling of knowing you in this place, I'm starting to think there are some things that can't be explained by science alone. David nodded. My grandmother used to tell me stories about people who were meant to find each other. She said some connections are so strong that they exist across time and distance and even death. I always thought she was being romantic and sentimental. What do you think now? Elena asked. David looked into her green eyes and felt something click into place inside his chest, like a key turning in a lock that had been waiting to be opened for years. Now, I think maybe my grandmother knew more about love and connection than I ever gave her credit for. David woke up slowly, his neck stiff from sleeping on the sofa. The morning light was streaming through the living room windows, and for a moment, he couldn't remember why he wasn't in his bed. Then the memories of the night before came rushing back, and he sat up quickly, looking around the room. Elena was gone. The sofa cushion where she had been sitting was cold, and her small bag was nowhere to be seen. David's heart sank. Had he dreamed the whole thing? Had the stress of his deadline and the loneliness of living alone finally made him lose his mind? But then he smelled something that made him pause. Coffee. Fresh coffee brewing in the kitchen, and something else. Something that smelled like breakfast. David stood up and walked toward the kitchen, his bare feet silent on the wooden floor. Elena stood at the stove, wearing her own clothes now, dry and neat. She had found his grandmother's old apron hanging in the pantry and tied it around her waist. She was making pancakes, and on the counter were ingredients that David was certain he didn't have in his kitchen. Fresh blueberries, real maple syrup, and eggs that looked farm fresh. Good morning, Elena said without turning around. I hope you don't mind that I made breakfast. I brought some things with me and I thought we might both be hungry. David rubbed his eyes, still trying to process what he was seeing. You brought breakfast ingredients? I stopped at a farm stand yesterday. On my way here, Elena explained, flipping a pancake with practiced ease. I don't know why, but I had this strong feeling that I should buy things for breakfast. Blueberries, eggs, bacon. It was like I was shopping for two people even though I was traveling alone. David watched her move around his kitchen with the same confidence she had shown the night before. She knew where he kept his plates, where the forks were, how he liked his coffee. It was unsettling and comforting at the same time. Elena, David said carefully, I need to ask you something. Ask away, she said, sliding two perfect pancakes onto a plate. Last night, when you knew about the hidden compartment in the cabinet, that really shook me up. Can you tell me other things about this cottage that you shouldn't know? Elena set the plate of pancakes on the kitchen table and looked at David thoughtfully. Are you sure you want to know? Because once I tell you, there won't be any way to explain it away as coincidence. David nodded, though part of him wasn't sure he was ready for whatever she was about to say. Elena poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from him at the small kitchen table. There's a loose step on the back porch, she said. The 3rd one from the top. It wobbles when you step on it and it makes a squeaking sound. David had noticed that step his first week in the cottage. He kept meaning to fix it, but never got around to it. There's a bird that comes to this window every morning, Elena continued, pointing to the kitchen window. A small red bird. It taps on the glass exactly 3 times, then flies away. David nearly choked on his coffee. Every single morning for 6 months, a cardinal had come to that window and tapped 3 times. David had started looking forward to it, like the bird was saying good morning to him. In the bedroom upstairs, Elena went on, there's a window that sticks. You have to push it up with both hands and prop it open with a book, or it'll slam shut. David stared at her. The window in his bedroom had been giving him trouble since he moved in. He had developed the exact routine Elena described, using whatever book he was reading to keep the window open. There's more, Elena said quietly. Your grandmother's jewelry box is in the top drawer of the dresser upstairs. It's made of dark wood with a small brass key. And inside it, along with her old rings and necklaces, there are letters. Letters written to someone named My Dear Friend. David's fork clattered to his plate. He had found those letters just last week when he was looking for something to store his own printed letters in. His grandmother's letters were old and faded, written to someone she clearly cared about deeply, but David had never known who My Dear Friend was supposed to be. How could you possibly know about those letters? David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Because in my dreams I found them too, Elena said. And in my dreams I knew they were meant for me to find someday. David pushed his plate away, his appetite gone. The logical part of his mind was screaming that this was impossible, that there had to be a rational explanation. But the evidence was mounting up like snow in a blizzard, and soon it would be too deep to ignore. Elena, I need to show you something, David said, standing up abruptly. He led her upstairs to his bedroom and opened the dresser drawer. The jewelry box sat exactly where Elena had described it. David took it out and opened it with the small, brass key that was always kept inside the lock. Inside, among his grandmother's few pieces of jewelry, were the old letters tied with a faded ribbon. But underneath those letters were the new ones David had printed out just last week, his letters to an unknown someone, written over the past 6 months. Elena gasped when she saw them. May I? She asked, reaching toward the newer letters. David nodded, though his hands were shaking. Elena untied the string holding his letters, together, and read the top one silently. As she read, tears started to form in her eyes. David, she said softly, this letter is about the cardinal that comes to the window. You wrote about how it makes you feel less alone, how you've started saving pieces of bread to throw outside for it. David had written that letter just 2 weeks ago. During a particularly lonely evening, Elena picked up another letter. This one is about the loose step on the porch. You wrote about how you keep meaning to fix it, but somehow you like the way it announces when someone is coming to visit, even though no one ever does. She looked up at David with wonder in her eyes. These letters, David, they're not just random thoughts, they're letters to me. You've been writing to me for 6 months, and I've been dreaming about living here with you for 6 months. David sat heavily on the edge of his bed. But that's impossible. People can't share dreams. They can't know about places they've never been or people they've never met. Elena sat next to him on the bed, careful to keep some distance between them, but close enough that he could feel her presence. What if it's not impossible? She asked gently. What if there are some connections that exist beyond what we can see and touch and prove? David looked around his bedroom, this room that had belonged to his grandmother for so many years. On a die, the dresser was a framed photo of his grandmother as a young woman, standing in front of the cottage with a man David had never been able to identify. His grandmother had always been mysterious about her past, always hinting at great love stories, but never giving details. "My grandmother used to say that love was bigger than one lifetime," David said slowly. "She said that some souls agree to find each other again and again whenever they need each other most." Elena picked up the photo from the dresser and studied it. "She looks happy in this picture. Really, truly happy. She told me once that she had been deeply in love when she was young, but that the timing was wrong," David said. "She said they had to wait for another chance and another time." Elena set the photo down and looked at David directly. "What if we're there another chance?" The question hung in the air between them, impossible and logical at the same time. David thought about all the strange coincidences, all the unexplained feelings, all the ways that Elena's arrival had felt like coming home rather than meeting a stranger. "If that's true," David said slowly, "then what do we do now?" Elena smiled, and it was the first truly joyful expression David had seen on her face since she arrived. "Now we decide if we're brave enough to believe in something that can't be proven but feels more real than anything else in our lives." David looked into her green eyes and felt that same click of recognition he had experienced the night before. But now it was stronger, deeper, like puzzle pieces that had been scattered across time finally finding their way back together. "I'm scared," David admitted. "So am I," Elena said. "But I'm more scared of walking away from this and spending the rest of my life wondering what might have been." Outside the bedroom window, the cardinal landed on the sill and tapped 3 times, just as Elena had said it would. Both David and Elena turned to look at it, and the bird seemed to look back at them for a long moment before flying away. "Even the bird knows," Elena said with a soft laugh. And despite everything his rational mind was telling him, David found himself laughing too. 3 days had passed since Elena's arrival, and David felt like he was living in a completely different world. The cottage that had been his quiet retreat from life had become something magical, filled with laughter and conversation and the comfortable presence of someone who understood him in ways he had never experienced before. Elena had called her supervisor in Boston and extended her leave of absence. She told them she was dealing with a family situation, which wasn't entirely untrue. In a way, she was dealing with the most important family situation of her life, even if that family was just her and David, and the mysterious connection that had brought them together. David had finished his article and submitted it early, his writing flowing more easily than it had in months. Having Elena nearby while he worked felt natural and inspiring. She would sit in the living room with a sketch pad she had brought in her bag, drawing pictures of the cottage and the surrounding woods while he typed at his desk. Sometimes they would work in comfortable silence, and sometimes they would talk about their ideas and dreams. On this particular morning, Elena was making breakfast again when David came downstairs. She had driven into town the day before and bought more supplies, and she seemed to take genuine joy in cooking for both of them. David had always been a simple breakfast person, usually just coffee and toast, but Elena had introduced him to elaborate morning meals that made the start of each day feel like a celebration. "I've been thinking," Elena said as she scrambled eggs in his grandmother's old cast-iron pan, "about what happens next." David poured himself coffee and sat at the kitchen table. They had been avoiding this conversation for 3 days, both of them afraid to break the spell by talking about practical matters like jobs and houses, and the life Elena had left behind in Boston. "I have a job in Boston," Elena continued. "An apartment, friends, a whole life that I've built over the past 5 years. I can't just abandon all of that, can I?" David felt his stomach tighten. He had been dreading this moment, when reality would intrude on the perfect bubble they had created together. "Of course you can't," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "You have responsibilities." Elena turned from the stove to face him. "But I also have something here that I've been searching for my entire life without even knowing I was searching for it." "Elena," David said carefully, "I don't want you to make any big decisions based on 3 days and some strange dreams. What if this feeling fades? What if we're just caught up in the mystery and romance of it all?" Elena served the eggs and sat across from him. "What if we're not?" she countered. "What if this is exactly what it feels like? and we're both just scared to trust something so unexpected and wonderful? David took a bite of his eggs, buying himself time to think. Elena was right to be cautious, but she was also right about the fear. David had never felt this connected to another person, never felt so completely understood and accepted. The thought of Elena leaving made his chest ache in a way that seemed way out of proportion for someone he had known for only 3 days. "I've been thinking too," David said finally, "about my grandmother and her stories about soul connections. I found something yesterday that I want to show you." After breakfast, David led Elena up to the small attic room he had been avoiding since moving into the cottage. It was dusty and filled with boxes of his grandmother's belongings that he hadn't had the heart to go through yet. David opened a trunk in the corner and pulled out a leather journal, older and more worn than the one downstairs. "This was my grandmother's diary from when she was young," he said. "I found it yesterday when I was looking for that old typewriter you mentioned." Elena sat on a dusty chair while David opened the journal to a page he had marked with a ribbon. "Listen to this," he said, and began to read aloud. "Today I met him again, in a dream so vivid I could smell the coffee we shared and feel the warmth of his hand in mine. It has been 3 months since the last dream, and I was beginning to think I had imagined it all. But there he was, waiting for me in that little cottage by the lake, the one that exists only in our dreams. We talked about books and music and the way the morning light looks different when you're truly happy. When I woke up, I cried for an hour, not because I was sad, but because I felt so grateful to know that such love exists, even if I can't have it in this lifetime." Elena's eyes were wide. "When did she write that?" David checked the date at the top of the page. 1952. She was 23 years old. "The same age I was when I got married to the wrong person," Elena whispered. David turned to another marked page. "I have decided to buy the cottage," he read. "It doesn't exist yet in the real world, but I have seen it so clearly in my dreams that I know exactly what it should look like. I will build it by the lake, with windows that face east to catch the morning light, and a kitchen where 2 people can cook together without getting in each other's way. I may never get to share it with him in this life, but perhaps someday, 2 other souls who are meant to be together will find their way there. Love doesn't end with one lifetime. It finds a way to continue." Elena was crying now, tears streaming down her face. "She built this cottage for us." David closed the journal and looked around the dusty attic. "There's more. I found blueprints, sketches, letters to contractors. She designed every detail of this place with 2 people in mind. 2 people who would need to find each other." Elena stood up and walked to the small attic window that looked out over the lake. "David, this changes everything." "Does it?" David asked. "Or does it just confirm what we already knew in our hearts?" Elena turned back to him. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Okay. If I stayed here, if I found a way to move my life to this place, would you want that? Not because it's mysterious or romantic, but because you genuinely want to build a life with me?" David set down the journal and walked to where Elena stood by the window. The morning light was streaming across her face, highlighting the green in her eyes and the auburn in her hair. She looked nervous and hopeful and beautiful, and David realized that he had never seen anything as lovely as this woman who had appeared in his life, like an answer to a question he hadn't known he was asking. "Elena," David said, taking her hands in his. 3 days ago I was living half a life, going through the motions of being a writer and a person but never feeling fully alive. Since you walked through that door, I feel like I've been holding my breath my entire life and can finally breathe." Elena squeezed his hands. "Is that a yes?" David smiled. "That's a yes to whatever you're willing to try. If you want to go back to Boston and see if we can make this work long distance, I'll drive down there every weekend. If you want to move here, I'll help you find work nearby, or we'll figure out how you can do your therapy work remotely. If you want to take this slowly and see how we feel in 6 months, I'll wait." "What I want," Elena said, "is to wake up tomorrow morning and make breakfast with you again. And then I want to do it the day after that, and the day after that, for as long as you'll have me." That could be a very long time, David warned her with a grin. I'm counting on it, Elena replied. They were interrupted by the sound of a car coming up the driveway. David and Elena looked out the attic window and saw an unfamiliar silver car parking next to Elena's vehicle. Are you expecting someone? Elena asked. No, David said, feeling puzzled. No one ever comes here. They went downstairs and watched through the front window as a woman got out of the car. She was about 35, with dark hair and a nervous expression. She stood by her car for a moment, looking at the cottage with the same expression of recognition that Elena had worn 3 days earlier. Oh my, Elena whispered. David, look at her face. The woman walked slowly toward the front door, then stopped and stared at it like she was remembering something important. She raised her hand to knock, then lowered it. Then she raised it again. David and Elena looked at each other. Do you think, Elena began. I think, David said slowly, that my grandmother was right about this place bringing people together when they need each other most. Elena squeezed David's hand. Should we answer the door? David squeezed back. I think we should. After all, 3 days ago you walked through that door looking exactly like she does right now. Maybe it's our turn to help someone else find what they're looking for. Together they walked to the front door and opened it, ready to welcome another lost soul who had somehow found her way to the cottage where impossible things happened. And love had a way of transcending time and logic, and everything that people thought they knew about how the world worked. The woman looked at them with tears in her eyes. I know this sounds crazy, she said, but I've been dreaming about this place. David and Elena smiled at each other, then looked back at the woman with warmth and understanding. It doesn't sound crazy at all, Elena said gently. Come in. Let's make some tea and talk about your dreams. And as the woman stepped across the threshold of the cottage, David felt the same sense of rightness he had experienced when Elena arrived. This place, this magical little cottage his grandmother had built with such love and intention, was doing exactly what it was meant to do. It was bringing people home.